from my perspective, I think we have a lot of material to discuss and we have a lot of things to align. The most important things I think we have to align on is whether we are all on board regarding subjective versus objective, because that was still a bit up in the air, I think, even after San Francisco. If we are all aligned that we want to go with objective PMM for at least the desaturations laboratories, then I think the big question is, how precise do we want it to be? I think most of the devices are very precise and accurate already. And then the last big thing to discuss is, I think, how do we want to filter out the real bad colorimeters? But let me first go back to the first one regarding whether we are still discussing whether to go with objective or with subjective methods.
I think we also talked, or should talk about, there's two phases here. There's recruitment to get the broad, diverse set of subjects enrolled in the program or into the studies, right? And then there's evaluation of the characteristics that we think are impacting bias, right? And those are different. So we're using different tools to accomplish both of those means.
I agree with that. I think in San Francisco, we were quite clear on that the PMM, the skin color measurements, were a tool that works under the hypothesis that skin color is related to the bias, but that is only a hypothesis. And it might be the presence of melanin, the absence of melanin. It might only be correlated with something else. But if we want to go back to that, to the root cause of the pulse oximetry bias, then I think we have been on the wrong track. I think we have been under the assumption, the working hypothesis that measuring skin color is a useful tool to improve recruitment and inclusion. That's my impression and my understanding.
So I think what Sandy maybe was saying, and I think I understand where you're coming from, Sandy, and I kind of agree. Like, you could have two parts of the process of doing these studies. Number one is, how do you ensure that you have a diverse population that is included in these studies? And from the discussions in San Francisco, we talked about how it was important to potentially oversample the extremes, right? Like to ensure that we have some very lightly pigmented and very darkly pigmented subjects. If that is the only task at hand, like let's imagine a world where that's the only task at hand, we want to ensure that we have darkly pigmented and lightly pigmented subjects at the extremes of pigmentation, then I think that that task could be achieved with a visual subjective scale. Because in the data we've looked at, multiple of us have presented through the San Francisco studies, data that's in literature, someone who is very, very light-skinned does get characterized in bin number 1, whether it's ITA bin number 1, Fitzpatrick number 1, Monk number 1 or 2, it's at the top of the scale. And people who are very dark get characterized either subjectively or objectively in the dark category of whatever bin we're using. The trouble is, people in the middle, there's subjective scales, I think, fundamentally fail. And I think that there are people who are darker than the darkest Fitzpatrick color code and who are lighter than the lightest Fitzpatrick color code. But you would still put them in the bin number 1 or bin number 6. You'd still separate them appropriately into dark versus light. And so I think from that perspective, from a perspective of enrollment, subject enrollment, I don't think you need the most robust device or even any device. I think honestly, it can be done by eye. I think that however, understanding whether the actual characteristics of how light interacts with tissue, how that impacts the pulse oximeter accuracy, I think that using a subjective scale for that is a missed opportunity and probably will give you a lot of noise that just doesn't reflect reality. I think in those cases, using a robust spectroscopic approach makes the most sense, because then you can try to have a more accurate decoupling between the optical properties of the tissue and the pulse oximeter signal. And in those studies, I think measuring forehead spectroscopic signal and then using a pulse oximeter on the figure doesn't really make sense. I think you have to measure the properties at the site where you're making the measurement. So I do think there are two different types of questions being asked. One is, how do we ensure standardized data that is kind of spectroscopic or colorimetric type data for the purposes of understanding the root cause? And the other is, how can we ensure that a sufficient number of darkly pigmented and lightly pigmented subjects are enrolled? And I think for those two questions, there potentially are two separate solutions. The nice thing about using a non-subjective measure is that it'll work for both, right? It's kind of less complicated. Like, we don't have to explain, like, yeah, you can use some subjective scales for this, but not others. I mean, I think that's more of like a salesmanship, like what's the most practical thing to do. But I agree with you, Sandy. There are kind of two different approaches here.
I don't quite agree. I think you mentioned the Fitzpatrick scale, but then the first question comes to mind: which Fitzpatrick scale, which printer, which
No, I think we were. I'm just gonna. I think
but I think the worry was that we have you could end up with the same people ending up in different bins, and that's what you will have with subjective scale. The extremes, perhaps not, but
that's what I'm saying. It's the extremes. If what we care about is
not in reality, the people that show up are not the extremes.
Well, then they're not going to be enrolled, right? So if the goal is to enroll people at the extremes, then I don't think you need a very accurate test. If the goal is to make sure we appreciate the differences and the nuances, then we need an accurate test. But I think that's what Sandy was getting at, is there's an enrollment component and then there's the analysis of the data component.
But the enrollment will be very, very inaccurate and very moldable, if you will, if you use a subjective scale. That's the reality. If you have people that show up, they may, regarding on whether you want them into bin wonder, the dark, medium, or light, there is just a lot of imprecision involved in there. And in order to get that more precise, you will need much more operators.
Again, in the literature, when people compare Fitzpatrick versus ITA, there's a lot of imprecision in the middle, but people with light ITA are in bin 1 or 2 Fitzpatrick. People with dark ITA are in bin 5 or 6. That's the data CSF internally. Again, if the bins we're looking at are the extremes, then I think it's okay. If we're including the middle, then I don't think it's okay. Then I think we do need something that's not.
I think you will have different people showing up in different bins a lot of the times, and that leads to a lot of confusion in the results when you discuss it later on. And I think I've shown a lot of evidence of that with different operators, that the imprecision ends up about 7%. So if you do a simulation of people that are, I mean, if you take a very dark person and a very light person, yes, then there's no question about it. But a lot of people will be right on those borderlines between medium and dark, or between medium and light, and that's where the confusion will arise.
So, Wim, I thought we had talked about the Monk scale, or perhaps some modification to the Monk scale, where we could subjectively assess the population with reasonable reliability, enough to make sure that we span the observable pigmentation groups, if you will. And then we would march along with our ITA and use that to objectively assess the impact on saturation. That's where I thought we were at.
Yeah, and likewise. So I wanted to add that bit, but I think most importantly at this juncture is to get something written that you can agree upon represents the methodology used. And I think we already have several things established, but without a structure, people are going to be doing independent studies and none of them can be comparable. So that's my caution.
If I may really quickly, just speak to a couple of points that Leo made also, with respect to them. So we've done extensive testing at Google on using the MST, on using the Monk scale. And we've even compared it to a 40-point scale. We've compared it to the Fitzpatrick. Meta, Facebook recently adopted the MST, the Monk scale as well. The kind of reliability that we get, plus or minus 1 point on this 10-point scale, is well over 90%. And this is using samples of annotators from all over the world. So I think some of the concerns over the imprecision or lack of accuracy with the subjective scales being somewhat overstated here. I would just caution that if someone is, say, in an exemplar set, and we've built an exemplar set at Google, is supposed to be a 9 on the MST, the probability that someone is going to say they're a 6 or even a 7 is extremely low. And this even, yes. And this is also the case when you even think about the points in the middle of the distribution of the scale. So I would just caution us not to overstate the inaccuracy of human beings be able to color match. I think if the practical goal is to make sure that our samples are representative, I agree very much with Leo that a subjective scale can and will be effective in doing that, while not saying a word about the second phase that Sandy is pointing to, only about the recruitment. I think a subjective scale is fine for that purpose. Meta, Facebook is using it, Google's using it for very similar reasons in their data set construction. The only other thing I'll add really quickly to this discussion, though, is that if we do not delineate which scale is recommended, at least for the next 4 or 5 years or what have you, then we open up the door for people to use whatever they want, and then you have problems around comparability. And as Leo pointed out, the Fitzpatrick doesn't get dark enough. I would also argue, based on our research, that it also doesn't get light enough. So you open up this Pandora's box where you don't have comparable studies, and you may also not have representation again.
As an engineer, I have to just make the quick statement. Usually the problems happen at the extremes, and normally right in the middle, everything works fine.
Right. And that's what was the discussion at UCSF. I think one of the takeaways was we need to oversample the extremes to kind of boost the power of the study. And I think I'm all for that. I would just say that if we stop at using the subjective scales and don't use objective measures for the actual studies themselves, then I just think it's a lost opportunity. I think that's it's really important that we make use of something like the Konica Minolta spectrophotometer at the site where the measurement's being made to get the data that is complementary to the data that the pulse oximeter is using to create its SpO2 estimate.
Now, Fifi, it sounds like we do have some agreement on several things. Are you capturing that in the minutes? Or Sandy?
Yeah,
Or
but
me?
I'm writing some minutes down. I shared the link. I'll share it again if others also want to.
Yeah, perfect. That'll be helpful. Okay, now my only plea is, hey, we've got data sitting out there, and Brianna is one, as you well know, Wim, that initially was going to be sharing some of this, and then we kind of shifted the meetings around. I would love to hear what she has to say, just because it will help us going forward, hopefully, in addressing some of that commonality in direction or in methodology, I guess is a better way to put it.
Shall we first
Wim?
Have Steve let his question go, and then we can start with the presentation? Is that a good idea, perhaps?
That works.
Thanks very much, Bob. I appreciate it. So I wanted to respond briefly to Leo's concern. If we were 100% certain that our accuracy concerns were strictly based off of skin tone, pumping up the enrollment to cover the edges would make sense. but we're not. We're not 100% sure that this is the sole factor. So in terms of representation, I think it probably more prudent that we have a more even balance of participants across all skin tones, including the middle, in case skin tone isn't the key factor, and our accuracy study then represents a more representative of everybody, and we don't just get the really light and the really dark participants. The other part is I do have draft text on what this might look like. So if people want to see that, I'm happy to share and discuss with members what that draft text looks like.
Please circulate.
Will do.
So
All right.
Brianna, you wanna?
Can I just quickly comment?
Sure.
Hi, Kimani Toussaint, Brown University. So I think the idea of having a subjective scale is fine, as articulated by others here from the enrollment perspective. I think it makes some sense. The one caveat that I would put forth is that, you know, the thing about subjective scales is that they're subjective. And thinking about pairing that with some level of training that people might be able to go through, I think could be useful. So if we're trying to compare studies done across different places and multiple people have different interpretations of what a 6 is, I can see that as being somewhat problematic. But I think, you know, there's value always in sort of the practical aspects of just someone just working off a scale like the Monk scale. But I would just think that there's perhaps a need to think about pairing that with some level of training and using that scale, whatever scale that one ultimately uses, but let's assume it's the Monk scale, for the purposes of enrollment.
Shall we now go to Brianna's presentation, perhaps?
Yeah. So hi, everybody, officially. I'm Brianna. Nice to meet you all virtually. I will try to share my screen here. Let me know if you guys can see it.
Yeah, we can see it. Brianna, I just
Okay.
just before I start, I didn't see your slide, so I just want to make sure you properly, that's not the right word, but anyway, comprehensively kind of like frame the problem that you're trying to address, just so, because we in the hour that we have, we need to be very targeted on finding solutions. So I'm just trying to hone people in on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just dive right in then. So the purpose of this study that I ran was to look at some quantitative data in regards to testing to the -85 standard for tissue oximetry. We wanted to ensure that we were representing all pigmentation factors as possible. So we were able to run this study. We did use the DSM-3 Cortex device. And so the subject selection for this study, we did reference the Fitzpatrick scale. And we categorized or binned in 3 bins. We had light, medium, and dark, as shown here. Type 1, 2, 3 from Fitzpatrick was light, 4 was medium, and 5 and 6 were dark. So we had 24 subjects total, 8 from each of the defined categories. And we measured 2 locations per individual. We were also able to take 5 measurements at each of those locations on each individual. We wanted to just see some repeatability. We recorded our erythema and melanin indices, and then L star, A star, B star. And then all of that data was collected same day in the same lighting environment by one measurement assessor. So are there any questions around the method and setup or purpose? Okay. So this is one of the slides that was sent out originally, but this is the erythema and melanin indices plotted against each other. We did this plot shows all 5 individual sites for each individual. So that's why there's much more data points here than 24. So it does actually seem to match literature pretty well. We have our light, medium, and dark categorized individuals. And based off of some of the correspondence with WIM, I did actually take a look, since we did record more data past that. I was able to calculate what the ITA was and plot that against the Fitzpatrick scale as well. So these are the 24 data points. And as you can see, we did categorize 1, 2, 3 within light category. And then our medium was category 4 and 5 and 6. So because we did have this binning of 1, 2, 3, we had less on, either end, which is something to just take into fact. But we did compare that to literature. It does seem to match what we've seen in literature. So these are the results of our small study that we were able to run. And then moving forward, I did order the Pantone skin tone guide. I do plan to evaluate the DSM-3 based off of those. I'm really curious to see what it's going to read. So I will be able to do that and share that data as well. So that's what I have for today. I don't know if you guys have any other questions around that.
Or perhaps advice?
Advice, yeah. What
Can you
can
go back
I?
a slide? Go back to your
Yes.
results slide. Thank you.
I see David Bush, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. So Leo and I had a conversation a few weeks ago using spectrophotometers on the Pantone or other printed standards. And I don't know if it's going to be an issue, but it is a piece of paper is not a diffusive medium, whereas the skin is. So we may want to be a little careful in using those devices or those items as a standard. That's totality of my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Josh Pepper, you have your hand up as well?
Hi, yeah, very nice presentation. This seems to confirm, what we've seen in the literature. I guess I'm wondering, was there something here that's new, that's different than what we've seen in the literature?
I think this device hasn't been looked at. That should be something that's new as a part of some of the data that has been looked at. Besides that, I'm just reiterating the data that I've been able to collect and gain results on.
Okay.
Do you have any advice past that?
No, I think it's always useful to, we spent a lot of time over the past year looking at the literature and seeing, and including in numerous papers that seem very similar to this. So I guess I'm always very interested in finding out what's new that isn't known already, and like the statement that David just made about these targets not being diffusive and therefore using targets to evaluate devices for measurement in skin. That's also something that's been done in the literature and has shown to be true, that it's not equivalent. So, I think it's very important that when we, start into the lab or develop new ideas for additional work, that we think about what are really the issues that are not known, and that we need to add knowledge to what's already existing.
Wim, I think you're muted. I see you're talking, but
Yeah, thanks. I agree, first of all, with David Bush that evaluation on Pantone's skin tone guide is just a piece of paper, and it is only good for filtering out really bad colorimeters. So I'm curious to see what the DSM-2 will give on that Pantone skin tone guide. I've worked with the DSM Cortex or the DSM-2 a long time ago, 15 years ago, and then it was really bad. But perhaps they are better now. The Courage and Kazaka devices also have improved, and I've been really impressed with some of the really inexpensive colorimeters by Color Reader. But I agree with David Bush that a true evaluation should be done on skin because it is translucent, and the limited collection aperture does make a difference then. But I also like to make a comment on the right figure that we see here. It looks a little bit as if the spread, the imprecision, is in the ITA, but if you would look at it carefully, it is actually more in the horizontal axis, and the color matching, in the color matching dimension, than the individual typology angle. The objective measurements typically have really a higher precision and accuracy than the color matching, and that is going back to the earlier discussion we had. I think color matching is useful for inclusion, but it's not going to be precise enough. And also, I think writing best practices for color matching methods is a lot of work and will require a lot of attention, because you will have to talk about printing, you'll have to talk about training, you have to talk about illumination, etc. And that's why I thought early on already, let's avoid that, because that requires a lot of stuff, and the relative gain you get with describing all these things, illumination, size, angle, operators, number of operators, ethnicity of operators, you name it, training of operators, that is not easy to describe. But if the majority wants to use and wants to standardize color matching, I'm all for it. Then let's go for it. But printing and illumination would need some attention, perhaps, and training.
I agree, but nonetheless, I think, Wim, you had nicely kept a thread of lots of emails, and you mentioned Leo's suggestion to have them test devices on the Pantone STG was also a workable site. It's clear we have many opinions. I just want to make sure consensus can start to get reached on some of these. And, you know, I come from another area, not so much the color side. And when it comes to measuring blood pressure, I had to do various things in order to make sure that there was validated test tools and objective testers that had a bona fide record from an audiologist that they could hear well. And now we're jumping into color where there are gradations of color blindness. So this gets to be a real mess. So
I'm afraid of that too. And I agree, I proposed to validate colorimeters using the Pantone skin tone guide, but that was mostly to get an impression of the different colorimeters, what's around. My suspicion was that they are quite good these days because they're used in the paint industry. And Wei Chung actually did find that some of the cheap ones, just $150, are actually quite good. And even on skin, they're quite good. But I do agree with Dave or Steve Bush. I'm sorry if I misremember your first name. A better, more accurate validation would be on skin. But either way, even if we validate it on this Pantone skin tone guide as a simple test, I think we would be more precise and accurate than color matching. But I think that message is come across. Josh or Steve or Alice, I do not know which was first.
I think I was. I would just, since we're touching on this topic of, how do you evaluate a colorimeter. And certainly I'm in agreement with the idea that human testing would be really the best way to do it. I mean, do we have time here to talk about a best practice for doing that? What would that look like? What would
or would we talk about what would the best practice for color matching schemes look like? Because that is a relatively chartered territory, I think. In my view, we have done much more testing on objective methods than on color matching in terms of precision and accuracy. What do people think, for example, of the example that I did with the printing? If you print it out on 10 different printers, even the same brand, you get a bias just from the printer if you have lighter or darker ink in your printer. How are we going to deal with that? Are we going to specify printers?
I thought we just established that using that approach was not, nearly as good as using human subjects. I mean, that the literature is really clear with this.
No, it's still about the discussion whether we want to have the colorimeter, I think, as a primary method for recruitment, or the color matching skill, or am I completely missing the point now?
That's where I wanted to jump in, Vim.
Yeah.
I think one of the hesitations we've had up until now with colorimetry is the expense. I know we've been using the Konica Minolta, which is a very expensive device, which might not make it accessible to a lot of our clinical partners. But if from Vim's latest email, we're talking like $150, $200 for a fairly reliable colorimeter, I think that a lot easier expectation than having training and hearing tests and color blindness tests as a prerequisite to qualify to do an SpO2 DSAT study. I'm also a little leery that we're diving really deep on how to do colorimetry as best as possible, but it's almost its own standard now. For the purposes we want to get back to is for SpO2 DSAT studies for their enrollment and for the purposes of using SpO2 sensors on patients. And in that case, in that setting, I don't think $150 or $200 investment is an unrealistic expectation for someone who wants to publish data on SpO2 accuracy. But with that, I'll get over to Ellis.
So just, really quickly, one, I just want to reemphasize that again, if the purpose practically is to recruit a diverse set of people representative of a skin tone distribution into your study, all of the work that I've done with Google, all the stuff that Meta Facebook's been doing, all the stuff I've been doing with my NIH funded study, looking at health disparities in the United States, strongly suggests that people can reliably use these subjective color matching methods, plus or minus 90% plus reliability all over the world in many of these different studies. So I really think that we have to be careful here about imposing things that may not be necessary, particularly in terms of the recruitment side of this two-stage process. The other thing I would add is that there's no evidence whatsoever that suggests that training is necessary at all for using these subjective methods. Certainly in the cognitive interviewing we did at the University of Chicago, there was very little, if any, training whatsoever, just kind of a little prompt, which is a paragraph telling people what to do, which is, match this color as best you can, blah, blah, blah. So 2 notes really quickly. One, we are working on an exemplar guide, which we will be releasing in the near future, which will have examples of human models that should match basically each point on the Monk scale on the MST. And the other thing is I've also been in conversations with Pantone over standardizing the printing of the MST, and we're actually pretty far along in those discussions. In fact, they've actually done a few mock-up prints of the MST anyway. So I'll just throw a couple of those points out as well. I don't think the subjective scale have the level of weaknesses that seem to be floating in the air.
Okay.
So I guess to that point, I don't see evidence in the literature to support that assertion. There's been a lot of discussion about the Monk scale, but I've seen very little peer-reviewed literature displaying evidence that it's a valid approach. So I think, with techniques that we've seen develop over the past decade or so, there's a long list of literature that talks about the pros and cons. And, it's really, it takes time for an approach to be evaluated. And I think it's going to be a long time before we really see what are the benefits and deficiencies of the monk approach. And certainly getting a healthy set of literature on this is critical, really, in order to have the scientific basis by which we can really justify incorporating it into a standard.
Just really quickly, if I may, I'm willing to share the paper or papers that we have with research using nationally representative samples using the scale. And at this point, Meta Facebook has also released a paper, Casual Conversations V2 data set, that uses it already as well. And these are large companies that have huge research budgets and have done internal research as well as some externalized research using the MST already. So while I appreciate your point, I don't think it's the case, and nor do I think it's accurate that there's no evidence whatsoever. The scale was just released to the public basically a year ago or more. So it's new, but there is some research. Otherwise, these large companies would not have jumped on board in the first place.
Leo?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about, in response to Steve's point about the inexpensive colorimeters. I think Dan just put this in the chat as well. Typically an inexpensive colorimeter will be like a tri-stimulus type device, where by some means, either 3 different light sources or 1 light source with 3 different filters, you are reconstructing the CIE color space and kind of presuming what color it would be under a set of assumptions, an illuminant, an observer angle, and these things will change depending on the device geometry, things about source detector separation, things like that. That will give you some information, and that information will be good for color matching. I think that that's true. However, if we're trying to unravel the optical characteristics of tissue and how they inform the SpO2 bias that has been shown in the literature and presumed to be associated with melanin due to both absorption and scatter effects, then I think we miss an opportunity by not getting a reflectance spectrum. I just think that there's a colorimeter essentially collapses that reflectance spectrum data from the Konica Minolta or an X-Rite, which is less expensive than a Konica Minolta. I'm not saying Konica Minolta is the only one, but it collapses that data into something that is less data rich, and I think potentially misses, again, this opportunity that I think have to ensure that the studies that go forward help answer this question definitively. I think that's an important point, and I think why it's important to separate out in my mind, the enrollment part, which I think compared to how we do enrollment now, even a rough scale approach where we just say we ensure that we have people with light pigmentation and dark pigmentation through some subjective means. I think that even if it's not validated through extensive peer review, I'm not sure that we run the risk of failing to enroll a diverse population by using that subjective approach. But if we don't use an objective approach for the actual data acquisition and don't use industry standards, then I do think we run that risk. So, I agree with Josh on that side. Like, there are established methods for extracting optical parameters. A colorimeter is far from that. A reflectance spectrometer is closer to that. So we should rely on that as our means of getting data. But that, in terms of the other side of it, in terms of enrollment, I think that's a practical question. And if we can do it with objective means, I don't think we'll fail, but I think it's possible to do it with subjective means.
So I'm not sure I agree with this idea of that enrollment and the final statistical analysis can be separated, like there have been several people who have been talking about. Because I would think that initially the way this is typically done is a biostatistician will define how many subjects should be in each of the different bins that they want to analyze. And the whole study is set up a priori based on certain categorizations and number of subjects. And so if the approach that's used initially does not align with the final method used in assessing pigmentation, then that those necessary characteristics for the statistical analysis are not going to be in place. So I'm not sure I agree with that idea that these two things can be differentiated or distinct. I think there has to be strong correlation between the two. The other thing about colorimetry and other approaches, I think there's been a lot of data in the literature that shows the strong relationship between colorimetry measurements and gold standard quantified epidermal melanin content. So it may not be theoretically a rigorous spectroscopic approach, but if you look in the literature, it actually does a better job than those spectroscopic approaches that quantify melanin index in terms of getting at the melanosome volume fraction.
I think the overall, the most important thing is that we ensure that proper inclusion is done, representative, that we ensure that enough really dark skinned people are included and really light skin, and that we have a good spread. And I agree that probably for recruitment you could use the MST, but that depends a little bit also on where you would put the borderlines for what you define dark. Because if you split it up in 3, then I'm afraid that there will be a lot of people on the borderline of, yeah, they're just dark enough perhaps to qualify as dark. And at least here in the Netherlands, if I recruit, then I do not get really dark skinned people. And I'm afraid that if we do not really have a precise method to determine the skin color or the complexion, we might stay in a sort of in an improved inclusion perhaps, but not really what we want. That is my worry. So my point is that setting the thresholds for dark, medium, light, that is almost more worthwhile to discuss than which pigmentation measurement method.
So that is, thank you, Wim. That is exactly why I think there's a challenge of relying on ITA or colorimetry methods for the inclusion. Because here's the thing, practically speaking, the literature right now in terms of the bins of light versus dark using ITA is based on either measurements done on lower back by the initial Chardon study or by measurements done on the face by the Delbino study. Both of those studies, one used sun exposed, one used sun unexposed, despite the fact that in one case there was sun exposure, which would increase pigmentation, they use the exact same cutoffs, 55, 41, you guys all know those numbers. If we're using those numbers, and yet what we're curious about is making measurements at the fingertip, then what is the bin that we're using for fingertip pigmentation to divide people, right?
Sorry to
interrupt. That's exactly it. So what I'm saying is that there is literature beyond the biophotonics and optics literature, like what Ellis has written in, like sociology literature, where other fields do bin subjects based on pigmentation and use these subjective scales. So it seems like there are two goals. One is we want to ensure a diversity of subjects being enrolled in the studies. And number two, we want to ensure that the measurements that we make reflect epidermal pigmentation at the site where melanin is where the signal is being measured. So if we were to use site-based measurements of epidermal melanin, there is not anything in the literature that tells us what the bins should be between light and dark. But we do have that information using subjective scales. So I think that's why I'm seeing kind of both of those approaches being valid for this purpose, because as I think through the process of fingertip measurement of ITA, I'm not sure how we use that information to effectively create bins that are reasonable.
We don't.
And Josh, please.
We don't. We should measure on a constitutive skin side. But Sandy has been fine for a while. Sandy, go ahead.
I'm just trying. I think I'm gonna remind us that some of the research is not going to happen today, tomorrow, next week, next month, and may take longer, and that's okay. But I think at the end of the day, we need to have a compromise on what we think is going to address the current challenge, which, you know, from a standards perspective and a science perspective, is to and so, you know, we may not get a perfect answer here, but we're going to have to try to figure out something that works, and we can revisit it in 2 years or 4 years or whatever needs to get done.
But what is your proposal then? What are you leaning towards?
We always have to remember that I'm an electrical engineer and not an optical person. so my again, some kind of, and I'm not going to use subjective objective method. I'm going to use some kind of relatively simple method that labs can use and people doing studies can use up front to assess whether they have a diverse study population. Right. And then we were going to use some kind of meter, I mean, ITA or whatever, to determine what the variable is that we think is impacting saturation bias. And so,
but that we do not know yet, right? We
well,
do not know if it's
we
the
were talking
absence
we were
of
talking about
melanin or-
well, we were talking about ITA, and right, we've seen lots of curves of ITA versus bias. Right. And then the conversation came around to, well, ITA doesn't have any A component in it, right? In either red, yellow, whatever it is.
But it also is not said that melanin or the absence of melanin is the root cause.
Well, I think that's one of the things we're going to have to compromise and make an assumption about, and state very clearly that as of now, we think that there's a fill in the blank, 90% chance or 90% confidence that it appears to be the chromophore of interest. Certainly has been a lot of work looking at it. And if we find out over the next few years that it's different and there are other factors, then we'll revisit this. But for now, I think we should assume that it is melanin that we're trying to characterize the impact of.
Okay. Josh, and then David.
Wanted to make a couple of comments about what Leo said about other fields that have been using subjective scales for a long time. In our extensive review of the literature, you know, anthropology is one of the areas where they've been doing these types of studies for a long time. They gave up using subjective scales 20 years ago. Most of those papers use objective methods, and they've been using them for decades. So, yeah, this idea that you know, the subjective scales are somehow superior and are being used by other fields, I don't think is consistent with the literature. About the idea of using a subjective scale for evaluating the finger, it doesn't seem realistic to me that it would provide a more accurate approach than an objective optical measurement.
David?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm rushing a little bit. David, and then Steve, or then Alice. First David, and then Alice.
I wanted to make. I had one more point I wanted to make here, and there. I think there's been either direct or kind of indirect talk about the idea of colorimetry being kind of this excessive burden, and especially some of the more expensive devices being too burdensome for companies. I need to put this. I think it's important to put this in context. We're talking about a companies doing desaturation studies, which I think are quite burdensome in of themselves. So adding the use of a $10,000 colorimeter is not really a significant added burden. I think you have to keep this in context a little bit.
So David and then Alice.
So thank you. Sandy, to your point about the hypothesis being melanin and that melanin is the issue. I guess I feel a little awkward saying this as not a clinician, but remember that sick people are the people who need these devices the most. And if Gorm was here, he would remind us about his neonates. Billy Rubin comes into this, various other issues. So I plan to move forward with a full spectrum measurement because for the sick people, I am less certain of the hypothesis of melanin being the issue. Thank you.
Let me just state for the record that currently this is being proposed for the idealized studies, which is on healthy individuals. The only variable in that study is hopefully saturation, right? All the other variables are supposed to disappear so that we can compare manufacturer A's box to manufacturer B's box. We're not adding in unhealthy because we can't deal with that yet.
Understood. Thank you.
Alice, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would just, like to clarify something here. In sociology and across the social sciences, which includes epidemiology, people who do health disparities research, people have and continue to use subjective color matching scales for their studies all over the world. Most of my expertise is in skin tone inequality and colorism at Harvard. That's the main work I do. And I can assure you that people use things like the Massey-Martin scale, Perla scale, Monk scale. They've been using these color scales for decades and will continue to do so because they serve one purpose very well, which is to make sure that they have a representative sample of people in a study. For instance, if you're interested in knowing the relationship between skin tone and, say, cardiovascular disease, other forms of inequality in society, and this is the kind of research I've been publishing here at Harvard and elsewhere for over a decade now.
Okay, Steve, and then Leo.
I think we need to approach this as not a one solution. So diversity incorporates lots of different things. There's the social constructs, there's the scientific constructs, there's the decision between measuring at the measurement site for SpO2 or measuring at a representative site. The answer, I think, is perhaps both. So in the draft text that I was putting together, the way I have it worded right now is that there's a place for a self-reported ethnicity, there's a place for a perceived skin tone, and there's a place for a representative skin tone. And then it'll be up to the regulators to decide on which scale they want the accuracy based. But that then covers all of our bases in terms of providing the data to make the comparison while we're in a state where we don't know for sure that it's site melanin, some other factor in addition to melanin, or something totally unrelated, or something that we can't see that's not specifically skin tone. So let's not think we have to come to one solution here. I think we can propose multiple angles.
No, I suspect the regulator is going to want you to make a recommendation. Certainly the standard is going to want to say, which is the primary variable that you're making a decision on.
Yeah. Well,
this is the body of experts that knows this material. You should not be relying on somebody else to pass the buck to. Pardon
sorry,
my...
let me be the voice of the chat a little bit. In the chat, we see a lot of comments arguing, why don't we use both? And I agree with that. And then it doesn't really matter anymore. It matters so much anymore which is the primary method to recruit on, because we will have both the subjective and the objective methods, metrics to do correlations on. I think we just have to keep in mind that the most important thing is that we do ensure that really both extremes are sampled enough. And that has to do with more with the cutoff threshold values rather than with the method used, I think. So can we agree and can we come to consensus that we use both for recruitment? Or no, we cannot only use one for recruitment for the cutoffs, but how would we do that? Would we vote?
I just think practically, so I just, sorry to interrupt, but like, so I think, first of all, I totally agree with Josh that the cost of a spectrophotometer is not something that should stop a large company who's doing these studies from doing a study. I think that cost compared to the cost of everything else we're talking about is really, it's overstated to say it's too expensive. I just want to make sure that I didn't misspeak before. I am not saying that we should use subjective measures to look at someone's fingertip pigmentation. That does not make any sense.
No.
We should use objective measurements at the fingertip, at the site. What I am saying, though, is that if we were to use ITA cutoffs that are published in the literature for light, tan, dark, or deeply pigmented, then those measurements, those cutoffs, are not intended to be made at the site of fingertip pulse oximetry.
No.
And so it would be inappropriate to use those bins. That's what the literature says, and there is no literature that I'm aware of that tells us what the range of ITA values is at the fingertip for darkly pigmented versus lightly pigmented subjects. So I am saying, practically speaking, I just don't, that if that exists, if we have that level of data like we have for Delbino on the forehead or on the cheek, great, we can use that. But I think practically speaking, we can use subjective scales to ensure diversity, and then objective scales when we actually make the measurement.
I just have to say, as somebody with some experience in setting up hypoxia labs, the cost of this thing is a drop in the bucket compared to buying 2 co-oximeters and all the other equipment you need to run one of these labs. So just from the, and then the other thing I was going to say is, please remember, and this is amplifying what Steve said, disentangling this error, the dark skin error, which I'm not questioning that it exists, but there are so many errors in pulse oximetry. Low perfusion is probably the worst one, and it's much harder to recruit. Do you, by the way, have low perfusion on the phone? So I just want to make sure nobody acts like this is the only error there, and finding out its impact is much harder.
But then I agree with that. And if I may take over, I think something that has not been discussed a lot is which anatomical location to use for recruitment. And I think we should not think even of using the fingertips, because on the finger pads and on the nails, we are all very similar. But I think when we have agreed on a location, where to do the recruitment on, then I don't think it matters a lot anymore which recruitment method we use, MST or objective methods using the ITA. But so is it okay if we move to a proposal, for example, using the constitute of the inner bicep as the primary location for recruitment, or do we want to use the forehead? The forehead does get darker with sun tanning, sun exposure, of course. Is that okay if some people have strong opinions on? I personally think it does not make any sense to measure on the fingertips or do color matching on the fingertips. That doesn't make sense for a bunch of reasons. That is not representative of somebody's complexion. That is one reason
to measure. Sorry, the reason to measure on the fingertips is because that's where the device is applied.
I know that.
The challenge, as you point out, is that the surface perception of pigmentation is much different than the fingertip.
Yeah.
But I think that's part of the research, which nobody's really done yet, or people have done it, but we don't have it in front of us to make a conclusion on.
Well,
Sandy,
I've also
that's exactly why we're saying separate it.
The range of skin pigmentation from dark skin to light skin on the finger pads is just very, very, very small compared to the range.
Right, I agree. I understand.
Well, I think for the actual spectrophotometer type measurement, it should be done at the site of pulse oximetry. But for inclusion criteria, I'm just saying practically, if you just looked at someone's fingertips, I think you would fail to ensure that you had a diverse population being recruited.
Right, I think we agree with you.
Yeah, we agree.
So that's why, Sandy, from your initial comment, that there's kind of two parts to this. One is a practical perspective of ensuring a diverse population is recruited. And the second is making more kind of biophotonics type measurements at the site.
And I think that splits the baby in as many different parts as we can split it into.
So who can come up with a proposal for
Well,
recruitment?
I heard that Steve already has a draft. I would suggest is we empower a small group of people and we know who they are, right? I mean, because it's the same people that have been commenting for the last 2 or 3 months. And I'm going to lock you in a room, a virtual room, until you come out with a draft. And Fifi's going to help me organize that so we can get it together. Because we're over time at the moment, right? So we.
Please unlock us after we're done then.
Yes.
I request food and water.
We'll see how you progress. Wim, should we wrap this up and let people go? And you and I will discuss and we'll make sure that I think we know who the people, well, I mean, we
but
can
please include Ellis also in.
Right. Well, it's going to be you and Ellis and Josh and Steve. The one person who wasn't here was, I think, Batchelder, because he does a lot of the testing. So we need a representative from each lab. And I might be missing some other people, but we'll get that together. I mean, if it gets too big, we're never going to get an answer. So we have to try to balance the size. And I'm not trying to exclude anybody, believe me.
No, exactly. I was just going to say, is there somebody who really wants to be in that group as well? That this would be the good moment to speak up, I think.
Or send Fifi or Wim or me an email.
I mean, I do remember Mike's remark that we are too non-diverse actually as a mainly active group, and I want to make sure that
absolutely. Well, we have Ellis. Ellis is hopefully helping us there, and I mean, if anybody else, I think there are others that chimed in a little bit. If they want to, you know, help us with that, that would be great.
Sandy, is it possible, or Steve, is it possible to put draft wording into a Google Doc for open comment among people who are attending today, this list?
Yeah, I think so. I think that Steve is going to send Fifi the document and she's going to post it on the Google site. Us Govies don't have access to that. We have to go figure out strange ways to get there, but it'll happen.
Yeah, that's the same thing for me. Using my work computer, I'm not able to access Google Docs.
Yeah, that's why you forward the email to your personal account. Oops.
Okay, but we can post it for you. We could accelerate some kind of feedback from everybody, try and be a little bit more inclusive, and then bring that back to the group. That's easy.
I think
here's what I would propose, at least in my experience. I mean, I think we're going to go one more round with trying to develop this document kind of as a group, and then we're going to put line numbers on it and formalize it, right? And then people can comment on it with a comment form, and when they comment, they will say, here's what I don't like, here's why, and here's my suggestion to change it. But we're not quite there yet. We're almost there.
Well, I said that a while ago in an email, and then Josh corrected me. No, we're not almost there. So that's famous last words.
Well, let me put it to you this way: the standard is convening in June. The standards committee is convening in June, and not too long after that, we are going to be held to the fire for having a draft of our standard. So if we don't have a version, then some of us are going to have to sit down there and magically put it together. Right?
Remember, it's a consensus document, so democracy rules in the end. So recognize some may have other opinions, but its majority goes for it. So
right. Perfection is the enemy of the good.
Amen.
That's
okay.
True.
I've got to jump to another meeting. All right. Thank you.
So Mike, will you take next steps? Mike Lipnick or Fifi or?
Yeah, I'll circle back with Fifi and we can, yep.
Mike, if actually you're willing to give me a shout.
So I think next steps is we impanel a small group of people that looks at Steve's draft and makes comments, improvements, suggestions, right? And we can quote formalize that a little bit. We will have a Zoom meeting in, I would say, within the next 2 weeks. Fifi and Mike and I and everybody else will figure out when that's going to be. And you know, from that we will create something that's more structured, because that will lead into the June meeting of the ISO committee. Did I leave anything out?
Is that end of June or early June?
June 8th, 6th, 8th. Last time I said it was on a Sunday. That wasn't right. It's on the Monday. I think it's the 5th or 6th. Early June.
So we got to get going.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.